Hi guys, today I've decided to deconstruct academics and the academic world, as young as you might be, whether you're a bachelor's degree, master's degree, or maybe even just post 16 writing an essay and not understanding why you need to reference it in a certain way. I am tired of not understanding it or whilst also being in the middle of it. I'm tired of feeling this way and I'm sure that you do too. So I've decided to take it apart and reveal behind the curtains what's actually going on in this hierarchical structure. You might have noticed that there is a big air of mystery within this world of science and academics. For me, it's always been a juxtaposition to see that these academic institutions have so much money and yet are basically being fueled by people who are working long hours, getting funded very, very low amounts of money, and doing this all in the pursuit of a passion project and truth seeking, whereas the people at the top tend to be the ones that are garnering most of the money that comes out of that. The popular imagery of researchers within science is of some kind of extra nerdy person who is passionate, who lives simply and modestly, and who spends all of their time basically in the pursuit of this one passion project that they have, whether it's within psychology, within economics, mathematics, physics, any of these topics, that this person is dedicated their life essentially to finding out everything that they can about this one passion that they have. But it doesn't seem like the academic institutions that they are basically working under kind of reflect this same mindset. In fact, something that's meant to be communal, nerdy, passionate pursuit of truth has turned more into something that's hierarchical, cold, and mainly focused on either citations or on funding, which is kind of not the imagery that's used when you're an undergraduate student looking into these academic institutions and just being invited in the first place. Anyway, today we're going to be tearing apart the academic machine. We're going to be seeing who runs it, who suffers under it, and most importantly, where the money is coming from. Universities love to act like they're intellectual, communal areas where everybody is equal and everybody has an equal voice in order to speak and to be heard when it comes to the scientific progress and the pursuit of truth. It purports to have values such as equality, democracy, but in reality, this is one of the most hierarchical systems in the world. I'm going to be mainly focusing on the European universities, since these are the universities that I mainly understand and have experience with. However, I will be making mention of some US universities as well, since they are big players and many of them work in similar ways. So let's start with the undergraduates, the bottom of the pyramid. These are your tuition payers. These are the main source of income for many academic institutions. They're essentially buying education, although when we say education in this instance, most of the time, let's be honest, they're just buying the degree certificate and they're just trying to get through the university course in order to then start on with their life and with their job, which is completely fine and it makes sense. They don't need to essentially get tangled up in all of the scientific world and understanding every single little thing about their subject. And let's also highlight that we've seen a rise in international students and the rising fee of these international students as they're being invited into these universities. This is where most of the money is coming from for these universities, specifically international students. And when it comes to the EU, this specifically means Asian students, for example, Chinese students, to get their education. It feels like more of a certificate and qualification factory than anything else, even though many professors do genuinely try to make an effort with students and try to help them and help them find passion within the subjects that they're teaching. More and more professors have found over time that these undergraduate students have less and less passion for the subjects that they're studying and more incentive to just bypass exams, get help, cheat, and essentially just get that certificate in order to move on in life. The second layer of the academic institution hierarchy is the master's and the PhD students. These are the foot soldiers. these are the people who will be working day and night. They're just young enough in the system in order to still be passionate and still have the disillusionment of the academic system being a pursuit of truth that is pure and clear. However, this is usually the point in which they start turning sour towards science itself. They run the experiments, they do the analyses, they sit in labs till 10 p.m. at night, working on their projects, truly just out of passion. Yes, a lot of them are funded maybe by external institutions or by corporations even. However, this funding tends to be relatively low depending on where you get your PhD from. Most of the time it's just to circumvent you having to worry about your economic and financial status as you're living your life throughout the however many year-long PhD that you're doing. Yes, you are getting paid for the amount of work that you're doing within a lab. However, it's not direct hour-by-hour monetary value that you're gaining. It's clearly dependent upon how much passion you're willing to put into the work that you're doing. You do the base work of the hierarchy. The next layer of this hierarchy is the postdocs. Now, the postdocs seem like they really have it rough as well. They tend to have 1 to 2 year contracts, which is relatively replaceable, and these are experts within the field. This is after you've done an undergraduate degree that you've paid for. This is after you've done a master's degree that you've maybe also paid for. This is after you've done a PhD where, okay, you've been paid maybe the lowest amount that you possibly can do within a country, and you've done copious amounts of labour. And this is all fueled by your passion and your genuine curiosity within your subject. And now that you're kind of an expert within your field, you then get a 1 to 2 year contract, maybe within a lab. Postdocs do get paid relatively well compared to PhD students, for example. This does kind of allow students to reach the level of actually doing science and research. This is when you get to the point of understanding your field and actually knowing what you can do in order to fulfill a research goal and purpose. The bad thing is that to be a postdoc, you can't choose the direction of your work. You need to find a lab that is willing to hire you as well as doing the things that you actually want to do. That leads me on to the next layer, the principal investigators. These are your lab leaders. They're essentially kind of the middle management of research and science. Their jobs kind of rely almost entirely on one thing, and that is funding. If you've ever met a PI or spoken to them for any amount of time, then they most likely have mentioned that they've had to submit a proposal for this kind of grant or this kind of funding, and that they're kind of in the midst of it. It seems like they're consistently worried or thinking about money and making sure that their lab and everyone who's working under the lab is sustained. So most of the things that principal investigators do is shaped by this pressure of money. The fifth layer of this academic institution is the tenured professors. If you've worked long enough within the scientific community to do your undergraduate degree, to do your master's degree, to do your PhD, to do a postdoc, to then work maybe as a PI, you then may be given the chance to work as a professor. Finally, after so much work and so much time put in, where you've gone through ups and downs of this academic, rigorous, weird system, where it tends to say that it's not hierarchical, even though it seriously and systematically is, you may then get some semblance of security. Tenured professors are basically the gold standard of where most science people want to be, or even if they don't directly think, oh, I want to be a tenured professor, this is kind of the gold standard of where you're getting paid to do research and you have autonomy in the research that you're doing. It makes sense that you have to jump through many different hoops in order to get this kind of status. However, I think there should be a little bit more clarity about the amount and the types of hoops that you have to jump through in order to get this. Tenured professors bring prestige, influence, and also get huge grants. The final layer is the administrators. These are at the top of the hierarchy because they basically lead all the directions and they have the most freedom when it comes to making decisions. Administration and the amount of people within administrative roles within academic institutions has grown year on year. And if we're looking at this hierarchy, usually you tend to think of a triangle where it's meant to be small at the top and large at the bottom. However, Over time, this has grown more into an hourglass shape where we have a high amount of administrators and a high amount of undergraduate students, and then this really small shrinking class of PhD and postdoctoral students who are doing most of the work, as I mentioned before, in terms of actually doing the science that is needed to be done, whereas getting the least amounts of benefits and the least amount of pay for it. Administrative roles, however, have grown faster than student roles, making this a kind of top-heavy hourglass shape, and we're almost waiting until it topples over. The administration staff decide who gets hired, the strategy of the whole academic institution, the branding, what counts as good research, and most importantly, how the money flows. As you can see through my portrayal of this hierarchy, money is kind of the blood and the treacle that is flowing through all of these different layers, and that supports them to some extent. Of course, as you can imagine, we're all supported and can't live without some kind of monetary income. It completely makes sense, and people need to make careers within science itself. However, when it comes to administrators being the ones who are in control and directing this and being the source of where the money is coming from, this whole system starts to turn a little bit more shadowy and unclear. Let's talk about incentives, since we've started talking about money and how it's the lifeblood of most of this scientific research. What are the incentives for research in general, and why do people pursue the specific topics that they do pursue? First incentive: publish or perish. I'm sure many of the scientific community have heard this saying. It means what it says. I mean, you either publish papers and you have something to say on your research that you're doing, no matter whether your research is short term, long term, you need to publish a paper. It's kind of like being a musician who needs to create songs in order to continue being a musician. Your success in the research world is judged by metrics such as publication numbers, number of citations, so other people who have also published their papers and who have referenced your paper as something that they have found interesting or have based their research on. And also it depends on which journals that you publish in. Now, journals are just a collection of publications, so they tend to come out maybe every quarter, every year, it depends on which journal, and they tend to specialize in a given field. So you might have, for example, a specific neuroscience journal or a specific economics journal, and they even have subtypes within that. Each journal has a different level of prestige, which we'll go into soon. Having a paper published within a journal just means that it's part of a publication collection of papers that have been reviewed by the journal's team and has been deemed as a good enough paper to actually be published within the journal. Oftentimes, it's sad to say that the publish or perish incentive doesn't actually ask questions about whether your research is meaningful or not, whether it's truly scientific or not. It is more based on the shock factor of your research and also whether you've got a positive result. It doesn't really answer questions about whether you've gotten closer to the truth or not. It doesn't really have this kind of clear rating of what science is meant to be. It's just about how thorough your graphs look, and most likely than not, whether you've found a significant difference or not between whatever you're studying. Shocking factors and significant values are obviously the ones that tend to be the most surprising and therefore tend to be the most alluring to readers. And so journals like to publish these more than findings of non-significance or pathways and avenues where researchers have gone down and have said there is nothing here to look for, so we shouldn't look for it any deeper. It's because of the fact that these voices and these research findings of non-significance have been basically taken from the public eye that we as a science community have continuously gone down the same routes over and over again, using different methodologies in order to pick apart and ask essentially the same questions, basically overlap in research in a silly way, where it feels like the progress that we're making starts getting more incrementally smaller and smaller and smaller as a community, and we're always looking for the next shocking significant finding rather than actually meaningful pursuit of truth and whether we're on the right pathway of what we're looking for within a given subject. It seems more like quantity of publications seems to be the goal, and this means that we have more and more of salami slicing, which is basically having a full research project be sliced into as many different publications as possible, meaning that one study might be split into 5 different papers that are hyper and super specific and make it almost unreadable for the layperson to understand what's going on, and makes it so that they have to puzzle piece together one subject in order to understand what's going on. It's just impossible to find yourself in. Every single subject has 5 different puzzle pieces that you need to find and piece together in order to understand what this one researcher actually did within this one single project, and to actually then pick out the holes and peer review it as any good researcher would do. It then also leads to citation cartels, where you basically have this follow for follow rhetoric where you cite me and I'll cite you is kind of an unspoken rule between research institutions and different labs, maybe within different departments. It's kind of like an under the table deal, which completely makes sense given the system, and I don't blame anyone for this kind of under the table deals in this economy, by getting more citations from each other. And it also has led to having a copious amount of authors on singular papers. You might have 20 or more authors being listed on a paper, and that's completely fine if all 20 of these people have contributed to this paper in this amount of research. But it also means that you never really know who to turn to and who to ask questions about when it comes to this line of research. So many people have written their names onto this one paper, particularly maybe, that it starts becoming unclear. The second incentive refers to the impact factor of journals. This is actually quite a huge thing within the research community. The value of a paper that you read is indirectly influenced by what journal it's published in. It kind of makes sense if you think about a book and seeing the publishers and who has published the book. If it's self-published, it might not be as good of a book as maybe being published by Penguin or a similar high-value publishing brand. But it also means that the impact factor that these journals are ranked by become a sort of currency, and kind of becomes a popularity contest between journals, between people, between labs. If you don't know what an impact factor is, it's basically defined by the average number of citations obtained in that year for citations that were published in the last 2 years. So for example, if you have a journal that was publishing papers in 2022 and 2023, the impact factor would be dependent on how many citations those papers got on average between those 2 years in the year of 2024. A journal with an impact factor of 3, for instance, in 2024 would have an average of 3 papers being cited from the years 2022 and 2023, so the 2 years preceding 2024. What's attempting to be captured here with these impact factors is the continued and longitudinal relevancy of the journals, and whether they have continuity as to the research that is being published within them. So what these journals are basically looking for is important, huge, seminal work that is significant. And this significance also needs to last for 1 or 2 years at least. The third incentive for researchers to continue to do research is funding. Universities don't just want researchers to get grants just for the research. Research grants aren't just purely for the research, and I think many people don't know that. You might be surprised to know that universities actually pocket over 50% of the research grants that they get for labs that are working underneath these academic institutions, and they call this overhead imperative. This is also a source of money similar to undergraduate students paying their student fees. It basically means that universities kind of have an incentive to pressure professors and principal investigators in order to get as many grants as possible, because essentially the university or the administrative staff get to swipe away almost 50% of the research grants that get granted for these actual scientific endeavors in order to pay for what they class as the overhead. And I just want to also say that most of these administrative staff, most but not all, many of them come from managerial positions and have a more business like acumen. This is why maybe the academic institutions have become more of this hierarchical, almost a boss at the top telling his employees what to do. This isn't what academic institutions kind of grew up from the ground roots to be. However, this is what they have turned out to be, which is why we have this clarity, I think, in these academic institutions. The incentive of funding also means that, of course, research is driven towards whatever people who want to invest the money into want research to be driven into. And where we have these large companies that have incentives specifically for consumers to continue to consuming a certain product, or to basically be shielded away from particular truths and dangers of the things that large corporations are selling, it means that a lot of research is guided away from truth rather than towards it, which again is unscientific in its nature. We truly go into this system with a clear heart and then are faced with many different waves of contradictions. Contradiction number one: we value teaching. In reality, 99% of career progression actually comes from research metrics and the outputs of your research and the amount of citations and publications rather than your teaching quality. This is kind of why maybe you've seen the experience of teaching in universities really dwindle and basically go to zero almost, especially with the addition of COVID and Zoom and online universities becoming a thing. That's not to say that teaching online is not a form of teaching and that isn't valid and helpful. However, still the quality of an online Zoom lesson might become even more detrimental to students. Additionally, so if an academic understands that their career progression really isn't hinged upon their teaching abilities at all, again, it's this over-reliance on the good-naturedness and the passion of the academics who are teaching, rather than giving them any kind of significant reward for being a good teacher versus a bad teacher in these academic institutions. Professors essentially get rewarded for teaching the least because then they have more chance of doing research and creating papers to then get more citations and more publications in better research journals. Contradiction number two: we promote intellectual freedom. In reality, a researcher follows the money. The only freedom there is the freedom of choice of whether they want to actually do research and get funded, or not do research and not get funded. For example, if the funder wants AI safety to be the main feature of the research, then AI safety will be researched to death. If there's no money, then your idea dies. That makes sense. I don't think that's completely unfair. However, we should not lie to our students and create maybe this idea of the fact that science is a free pursuit that has so much freedom and is actually the pursuit of truth in this way that it's purported to be in academic institutions. That's simply not the case. These are corporations and huge machines that only have one thing in mind as the incentive, which is money at the end of the day. Contradiction number three: we reward truth. The system does not reward truth. What is rewarded is compliance, performance, strategic alignments, and hitting the metrics that you need to, which is basically kind of like what you're rewarded with when you're working in a corporate job. It's just in a corporate job, you actually get paid a little bit more. No wonder most of the people are starting to diverge into working with corporations rather than sticking in the world of academia. Contradiction number four: we're transparent. In reality, most of the time, most academics have no idea where their money is being spent because it's mostly being handled by the overheads and by the administrative staff that, as I mentioned, are at the top of the hierarchy. Most academics also don't know why some departments get money and why some departments don't get money. They might speculate, and this is why maybe this culture of academics kind of coming together, being almost like a mother's group, spreading rumors around about their other academic departments and why one has funding and why another one doesn't have funding, and why this tends to be quite a cutthroat environment when it comes to rumors and a popularity race. Most academics also have no idea about how hiring happens and why it happens, and also why certain fields get prioritized. Most of this is kept in the dark. You only get the outputs of what the funders want and what the administrative staff decides is necessary for the academic institution. The actual workforce doesn't really get a say most of the time. They just have to do what they're being told to do. So the scientific process is not all about transparency. It's not all about rewarding the truth. It's not all about promoting intellectual freedom, and it doesn't really value teaching. Who are the winners in this system? The administrators are prime winners. The senior professors, maybe who have got tenure, tend to be winners as well, if you're allowed and if you fit in with the academic rubric of the institution that you're a part of. And finally, the major donors who actually fund the research and the industry partners who get to get the findings that they essentially paid for to get. Who are the losers? Well, we have the PhD students, we have the undergraduate students who get subpar education because teaching isn't that important. We have the postdoctoral students who, being specialists in their fields, don't really get long contracts and are uncertain of their jobs most of the time. And finally, the taxpayer who actually funds some of the research that is actually industry aligned rather than scientific or public aligned, and also fund some of the administrative staff that work in these institutions. And that's not even to mention the external institutions that fund, for example, activism on university grounds, that purport different kinds of agendas that aren't really ground roots to what being a student feels like. Of course, academic institutions are meant to be open, free speech campuses which garner different kinds of ideas and allow for discussions to happen. However, when you have these other external players who fund and direct the kind of conversations that should be had, this starts to muddy the ground and makes for an unclear pursuit of truth. Whose truth are we truly pursuing? I don't want to end on a sour note. I kind of want to present maybe a different way of thinking or a different way that things could be and how things could be solved, even given the situation that we're in at the moment, which is kind of a skydive downwards. As I mentioned before, we're kind of waiting for this top heavy hourglass to basically crash and spill over. I believe that we need fewer metrics and more trust between researchers. We need stable and independent fellowships for scientists. We need more transparency about funding because then there can be conversations that can be had. We need to definitely reduce administrative bloat. There does not need to be that many administrative roles within these institutions. There also needs to be recognition for teaching. There are some incredible professors out there who do it just for the passion of being a teacher and seeing that their students understand the topic, rather than just reading out words on a slide and getting the shortest amount of time that they can with their students in order to continue their research and create papers and citations. These people who know how to teach need to have some kind of reward for it, truly, truly. And we need to also reward risk taking because that's what science is. It's taking a risk on pathways that nobody has gone on before and maybe asking the question of, but what about this? And risk taking isn't something that is actually garnered within this environment at the moment. In fact, it's against risk. You don't get funded for taking risks. You get funded for doing whatever is already told of you to do within a certain subject and what the pathway that has already been paved through multiple different citations and through multiple different papers before. The people who get heard and who get published aren't always the people who are right, and the people who get funded are certainly not the people who are mostly innovative. The people who succeed even aren't the ones who have contributed the most work. But I think that once you understand the metrics and the hierarchy and kind of follow the money a little bit, you start understanding this system and why it works the way in which it does at the moment. And maybe if we actually are able to diagnose ourselves and see where the scientific world has gone wrong, we can actually apply some kind of treatment or some rehabilitation to this system and make sure that we are not going deeper and deeper into this sickness. That's it.